you have the ability to make a lot of money quickly, then you have the ability to lose a lot of money quickly, whether that's the stock market or a business venture or whatever it might be. Now, the people who invested in Bitcoin, here at the beginning, or the people who invested in Amazon right away, they might disagree. So that's not to say that people aren't successful with it, but I think you'd find a whole lot more people that lost a lot of money in the process.
One degree of separation. The lines all cross, the stories align. One degree of separation. Who's the next? You'll know in time.
Welcome back to One Degree of Separation. This is the final episode in our six-part chain, and our guest represents one of the most compelling career pivots you'll ever hear. He started as an elite competitor, becoming a four-time All-American and a University of Washington record holder in the Javelin, even competing in the 1984 Olympic trials. But instead of pursuing coaching, he pivoted to a career where success is measured not in feet and inches, but in decades of security for families. He is now the longtime financial advisor and co-owner of Rockett Financial in Raymond, Washington. We're talking about the discipline of elite performance, the challenge of long-term planning, and how to win the financial marathon. Please welcome Bob Rockett. Before we dive in, if you're loving this chain, please subscribe to One Degree of Separation on your favorite podcast platform and follow us on social media at One Degree Pod. Now let's get to the interview. Hey, Bob, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here, Ryan.
Yeah, good to have you. So I want to start off first by having you tell me about how you met my last guest, Rod Hanley.
Okay. Well, Rod and I go back a long ways. It actually goes back to when I was still in college. Rod had graduated from college at a different university and had taken his first job as a CPA in downtown Seattle, working for one of the large firms. And he was looking for ways to kind of meet people in the area. And so he gravitated back towards one of the organizations he had been involved with in college, and it was called Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And so we had a chapter at the University of Washington where I was attending. And so he started, coming to those meetings, and we kind of hit it off and had a lot in common, and, became good friends from there. And then we've maintained that relationship over the years. We were in each other's wedding. And as a matter of fact, I was just with him about 2 weeks ago down in Arizona for vacation.
Okay. Yeah, him and I had a good conversation about different leadership techniques and things like that. He was fun to talk to.
It's great. Yeah, he's a good guy.
Yeah, so I know you in college at the University of Washington, you were a four-time All-American javelin thrower. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I guess, I was recruited pretty heavily out of college, went to a really small high school. It was, I think I graduated with 28 people in my class. And from there, I ended up having a pretty successful career with the javelin by, I think I was a ninth grader in high school and didn't really know much about track. And, saw them throwing this javelin out there one day and asked, what is that? And I said, well, it's an event we have. And I said, well, is that something I can do? And they said, yeah, sure. So there wasn't really any coaching that went along with it. You can imagine being at a small school like that. We just had one coach for all the events. And so I didn't really know what I was doing, but I did have a really strong arm. I don't know if you remember those presidential fitness tests that they used to do back in
Do
the
yeah.
80s and 90s. And a softball throw was one of the events that you did for that. And I could pretty much throw a softball the length of a football field. So I kind of had that going for me. And so what ended up happening was I had a pretty successful career in high school. My senior year, I was a high school All-American and was second in the nation. And from there, I got recruited by the University of Washington and was given a full scholarship. So, from there, I, went to the University of Washington, and the success continued. I, did well my freshman year. I think I, at the time had the second farthest throw ever for, somebody under the age of 19. So, I had that going for me. And then I, as you mentioned, was a four-time All-American, and I eventually got the school record, which that was probably a bigger accomplishment than doing the four-time All-American. And the reason was is that in track and field, the pole vault, the hammer throw, and the javelin throw are considered dangerous events. And so not all high schools across the country, offer those. So I think coming back in the 80s when I was competing, coming out of high school, I think there were 13 states that actually offered the javelin. And even like Washington State, up in the metropolitan areas like Seattle and Tacoma, they didn't offer it. So it was, more of your other areas. So because of that, there were a lot of international athletes that, came into the colleges. And so, like an example of that would be my, freshman year in college, I was an All-American. I placed sixth place at the NCAA meet that year, but I was the number 2 American. So it kind of tells you, the a
Yeah, so a
lot
lot of
of the
international.
yeah. And it was kind of good for us as competitors because most of those were the best from their countries. They were the ones that were making their Olympic teams. They just, were spending their college years there. The University of Washington was known to be a javelin throwing mecca. They had had several Olympic athletes come through there doing the javelin. And the last one, his name was Duncan Atwood. He was the current school record holder, and he actually went to the Olympics and he made the Olympic team in 1980 and 1984. So when I set that new school record, I think that had more impact to me of like, okay, I'm doing something good here. This is great.
Now,
Uh,
does that record still stand today?
yeah. So they went with a different javelin actually while I was there. So most all the universities had their own track, and typically the javelin was thrown down the center field part into a grass area. But with the javelin I was throwing, like my farthest throw was 288 feet. So you're, getting there towards the end of the football field, right? And the top people in the world that time were throwing over 300. Uh, I was like 20th in the world at that time, just to kind of put it in perspective. And they came out and said, you know, people are throwing it all the way through the infield onto the track at the other end. It's getting too dangerous. And so they changed the balance inside the javelin. The javelin was the same length, it was the same weight, but there is a balance inside of the javelin. And they moved that weight more forward. And so it wasn't as aerodynamic. As soon as the javelin started to lose speed, it would start to nose over. And so it just didn't go as far. So I think roughly it probably took off, 20 to 30 feet, from the javelin. So, and that happened, would have been my fourth year in college. So kind of towards my senior years when that transfer got made. So, and then the other big thing that happened to me during that time frame, um, this was 1985, so it was kind of after the 84 Olympic trials. And that's when I had set that school record and, thought things were going to be great. I was, 21 at that time. Javelin throwers don't really reach their prime until 28 or so, 28 to 30. So I thought my future, was going to be great. And, my goal was, make one of the Olympic teams in the future, but 88, being my next best option. But the week after I set that record at 288, I got a back injury. And unfortunately, through the process of it, it went from just being a strained muscle that we were treating. And because I kept throwing on it, it became a structural injury. And unfortunately, we didn't realize that the structural injury was there until the end of that, junior season. Uh, so by that time, though, the damage had already been done. So I never was competing at that elite level again after that.
Hmm.
So kind of my consolation is I had two peers that they were a couple of years older than I was. We were all throwing about the same, and they both did make Olympic teams. One of them made the the '88 team, and then the other one made the '88 and the '92 team. So I kind of like to think that, had I been able to stick with it, that I would have made it.
Yeah. So as is the case with a lot of athletes, injury kind of forced you out.
Yeah, for sure. It happens to a lot of us.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was talking to Rod, one thing he mentioned too is that you got a shout out from Colin Coward at one point.
Yes, I did. So yeah, Colin. Yeah, I guess most people know who he is, but he's a sports commentator, I guess, who used to be ESPN and now has his own show. And he actually grew up in a town nearby me, and it was also a small school. And he happened to be telling some of his, you know, coworkers that there was this guy named Bob Rockett. He was this great athlete in, in our little area, and did football and basketball and track, and then he went on to throw the javelin. And they're like, well, what's the odds of that? Javelin thrower by the last name Baraka. We think you're making this all up, Colin. We don't think you're telling us the truth. And so uh, he ended up finding some footage of me throwing in college, and he did a little segment where he explained a story about him, you know, being on the football team, and because he said I wasn't very good, I didn't even start, but we had a bunch of our players get in trouble, so they couldn't play in the game, so they put me in, and you know, we were right down by the goal line, and Bob Rocket was right over me, and I dove it in, for the touchdown, and you know, so he kind of played up that whole story, and anyway, it was nice to get the shout out. You
Yeah.
know,
Very
I,
cool. Very cool.
he went from being in a small pond to a very big pond, so
So after you finished college, you pivoted into the financial world. What inspired that?
yeah, I have always been somebody that was kind of a planner. So I don't know, if being in financial planning, was a kind of a natural fit because of that. But I always have been somebody who's kind of forward thinking, So, even in my early years, I was like, how am I going to pay for my college? I was figuring out, I'll go to a military academy and get it paid. And, then the Javelin took off, and, I got the full scholarship. And then it's like, well, what am I going to do with myself, after college? And I thought, well, I think I'll be one of those shoe representatives that goes and finds the next, Michael Jordan and signs him to a Nike contract. Because we had those same people in track and field. And when I was competing, I was sponsored by Adidas and Puma. And so I thought, these guys got a good gig here. They go around and talk to guys and get them to wear their gear and get to go to all the major meets. I think that's what I'd like to do. So in college, I did an Adidas internship, and that was kind of my plan. But as you can imagine, there's only a few shoe companies, which means there's only a few companies that have a representative doing that. And when I had my injury, that kind of hadn't really made my name on the international scene like I was hoping to do. And so I think that, the reality was that kind of started to get cut short. So my background in college was I was a communication business major, and I thought what I would most likely do is be in sales. As an interim, I was working at Boeing, the airplane company, um, and so I kind of looked into that. I was like, well, I'm not a pilot, and I don't have an engineering degree, so I'm probably not going to be out selling Boeing airplanes. So then I was thinking about other types of sales, retail sales, or some kind of territory like pharmaceutical sales. And none of that really appealed to me. And about that time, my mom had gotten into, the financial planning career. And she said, I think you should really take a look at this. I think you would like it. It is going to be sales. And, the great part about it is you like you're starting your own business. And, while it's hard initially creating your own clients, once you've got that, it kind of gets easier over time. You don't really have any startup costs like you do with a normal business. And, I think you would really value, the family flexibility and all of that, over time. And so that was great advice. My thought initially was I don't want to have to go sell life insurance, because the company that both she and I were working for was New York Life. So they're primarily a life insurance company. Um, but when I kind of found out that we could transition into financial planning, do investments and, kind of the full gamut, that kind of made all the difference. And, now looking back 37 years later, it's, obviously been a good decision for me, and all those things that we hoped it would be turned out to be that way. So,
Yeah, no, I
yeah.
definitely, when I was doing my research, I was looking at your website and I noticed that it's definitely a very family oriented business. How important is that to you?
Oh, very important, very important. My mom kind of came from a little bit of a sales background. And while we were only 1 year apart in the business, I started working up in Seattle in the business, and she was back in my hometown here of Raymond, Washington. And then after I got married, I'd probably been in the business like 2 years. I moved back to Raymond, and we eventually combined it to where it was one practice. So I worked with her for about 20 years. And so that was great. And then you probably saw on the website that, I work with my son now. He's been in the business 6 years, and I actually just recently, sold the business over to him. And so I'm working for him now.
Nice. So now I want to give people some practical financial advice they can take away from this episode too.
Okay.
So let's dive into a few different topics here. What do you think is the biggest mistake people make when they try to manage their money like a sprint instead of a marathon?
Yeah, I guess when I think about a sprint versus marathon, I guess a couple things come to mind. The first thing is I kind of makes me think of trying to make a bunch of money quickly. So if I think about it from that perspective, there's two things that kind of come to mind. One is just the risk involved with doing that. If you have the ability to make a lot of money quickly, then you have the ability to lose a lot of money quickly. Whether that's the stock market or a business venture or, you know, whatever it might be. Now, the people who invested in Bitcoin, here at the beginning, or the people who invested in, Amazon right away, they might disagree. So it's not to say that people aren't successful with it, but I think you'd find a whole lot more people that lost a lot of money in the process. And so typically wealth is built over time. It's not done quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am a fan of Bitcoin. You know, it has its highs and its lows. Right now, it's been kind of on the downside, so that's been a little
Yes,
rough. But
yes, yes. And it's,
so,
go ahead. I just, with the Bitcoin, it has become more popular over time, and it definitely trades more like a commodity. It does have its real ups and downs. It's not necessarily stable, and I don't think it can necessarily be a currency yet, although, that's kind of what it's being built out to be. But time will tell, oftentimes, it takes 20 years before, things kind of stabilize, whether it's, a new company like an Amazon or, whatever. So it's hard to tell what it might morph into.
yeah, and I think you bring up a good point that a friend of mine mentioned also is that the thing with Bitcoin is nobody really knows what it's going to be yet.
Right. Uh, And the other part of about it, you don't really know who the winner and losers are going to be out of that, right? There's, all kinds of other ones, whether it's Ethereum or whatever, all the, remember when the internet first started and, what was it? What's my space or whatever was the top one, I think. Can't even remember who it was, but they're not even in business anymore,
Oh,
So
MySpace.
MySpace, yeah.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
they were the top one at, they were the Bitcoin of today, and it just seemed like they were going to grab all the market share, and that's not what ended up happening. So I think that all can still, you know, there's still a lot of risk involved with it.
yeah, absolutely. So one thing that typical middle class families struggle with is debt. You know what is the single biggest strategy you can give to someone trying to tackle their debt?
Yeah, that's kind of a hard one, right? So I would agree with you that the biggest thing people face is debt, and probably specifically it's credit card debt. But that's not to say there isn't other kinds of consumer debt, whether it's, buying new vehicles or, whatever else it might be, student loans, Um, and typically it's, all there from overspending, right? Like you're not living within your means. It's self gratification of, I want this now, overtakes the practicality of, it's a want, not a need, you can live without it. So if the question is more somebody who already has a bunch of debt what to do about it. Um, each individual situation might be handled a little differently, but I think in general purposes, um, you typically are going to try to look to see what the different amounts are. If there's multiple amounts, multiple balances and different interest rates, you're trying to figure out how to help build momentum for them. Because we are creatures of habit, and unless we can break the habit, we're going to kind of be right back into it. So, what would be common would be to say, whatever's the highest interest rate, trying to get that paid off first. But we don't always look at it that way. If there's an account balance that maybe is smaller, even though maybe it has a lower interest rate, we would prefer to see them get that paid off first and try to build hey, congratulations, you got that one paid off. Now let's take that payment that you were paying on that and let's apply it to this next one. Um, and then just you're trying to help them change habits and have them feel good about what they've been doing, and not lose them along the way. Similar to kind of like losing weight. Everybody likes to think they are going to lose all kinds of weight and keep it off, but we lose our momentum along the way, and all of a sudden you're not doing it anymore. So that's kind of how we try to handle the debt. We try to come in alongside of them and help them.
So now you mentioned too that, credit card debt isn't the only type of debt and that people also can struggle with like car loans and things like that. Working in the TV industry, one thing I've seen and noticed that I'm definitely not a fan of is I see a lot of car commercials. And I noticed all these car commercials, they never tell you the full price of the car. They just tell you what
Right.
your monthly payment could be.
Yeah,
What's your
sure.
opinion on that?
Yeah. We don't advise too much on it, but if it ends up coming up, we'll address it. So, for us, we get the question again, is it better to lease? Is it better to buy? You know, should I borrow or should I pay it off? Like use money from the bank, just pay for it all off. And kind of what we always tell people is we can't really give them that advice until we know their complete picture. Where are all the assets at? What are they trying to do? What's the reasoning behind it? Because there is no hard and fast rule that, buying is always better than, leasing, or, leasing's always better than, I think there's always situations where either one could be true. And I think it would even be the same as far as, borrowing. Oftentimes, I would just use myself as an example. If I was going to go out and buy a new vehicle, I might have the money just to go pay for it, right out of one of my investment accounts. But maybe if it's been a slow economy and, they're not making the sales and now all of a sudden they're doing the 0% interest loan, I might choose to go ahead and take that loan and then I just make my payments from the investment account, to make it. And that way my money's still in there earning money, you know, but I'm paying off that loan. So, then I think to answer your other question about, hidden fees, that's, really just trying to make sure you understand what you're doing before you do it. So I think the first time somebody buys a car, they're shocked by it, and then after that, they kind of know that there's all the, licensing and taxes and, you know, the warranty and all that other stuff that gets tacked on after you read on the sales price.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned, the taking advantage of 0% loans. People like Dave Ramsey, they tell you, be debt free, don't ever use debt. But personally, I believe that if it's a good 0% loan, you can take advantage of it, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Like I'm a big tech consumer, so I have a Best Buy account that I use, and they do, 24 months, 0%. So I'll put something on that and just steadily pay it off. And that way I'm able to keep my money invested as well.
Yeah. We kind of find that with most of our clients, they fall into two categories. Either one, they have trouble with debt. And so we have to be careful about helping them, with those. Because one of the common strategies to consolidate debt too can be, uh, you have a house that has equity in it. Why don't you take a second line of credit against your house equity? It's going to be a lower interest rate. It might possibly be tax deductible, you know, um, and pay off all your credit card loans, which all sounds great in theory. But if you haven't, been able to get them to change the root causes of why they accumulate debt, they've just transferred over to there. And then now all of a sudden now they've built the credit cards back up and now they've got more debt than what they used to have. So I think some of it's just trying to help them on that emotional side of why did they buy things the way they do and try to get them to change. Sometimes you can help them and sometimes you can't. They just don't change. The other set of clients use debt in the sense of, we'll just use credit cards. They pay off their bill every month. They don't ever let a balance go forward. So yeah, they use credit cards and they charge on it, but they're paying them off.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's actually a
so
philosophy I follow as well.
yeah, so typically what we're always trying to do is look at the whole situation, what's totally involved with it. And then from there, we can kind of address what the issues are and then come up with strategies that are going to try to help them. And sometimes it might not even be a financial strategy. It's just trying to help them emotionally change their behaviors. So,
Yeah. So I know the ultimate goal you mentioned, debt isn't your specialty necessarily, but the goal is to get them to be able to start working towards retirement and to
yes.
eliminate that debt first. So what is the simplest tip you can give someone in their 20s or 30s that's starting to plan for retirement?
Yeah. Well, typically, hopefully, if they're in their 20s or 30s, we don't have too much debt. Hopefully, we don't have any debt. We're just kind of getting going in a career. If that was the case, what we would talk to them about is, starting to save money on a regular basis. And, typically what we want to get going on is, something for the retirement. So a common thing to do would be a Roth IRA. Uh, and, if somebody isn't familiar with that, what that is, it's, a retirement plan that allows you to put money in on an after tax basis after it's already been taxed, but anything it earns grows tax free. So, like an example, if we took somebody who was a 20-year-old as an example, and they saved $100 a month, for 45 years, which would put them out to age 65. And let's just say they're making 8% on that money. What they would have put into that account is 54,000 of their own money. But what it would have grown to is just about 500,000. So you can see the bulk of it is all the earnings that are growing tax free. So when they go at 65, start taking money out for retirement, they don't have to pay any taxes on any of that money. And just to take it one step further, if they made 10% on that money instead of 8%, they still would have only put their same 54,000 in it, but now they'd have just under $1 million. So just getting, that extra 2% over 45 years makes a huge difference. So it doubles the money. So, we would encourage, like all of my kids, right out of high school, as soon as they, had a job, they were putting money into a Roth IRA and trying to get them to just continue to keep bumping it up every time they had the ability to bump it up, keep putting more and more into it. And we just put them into kind of a stock kind of mutual fund with the idea is that they would, average 10% a year. So,
So if a company offers it, you definitely prefer a Roth IRA over a standard 401k.
yeah, so I think some of it depends, right? I'm thinking of my kids, working for a small employer, being self-employed, don't have the ability to do a 401k. But obviously, if they're working for a company, that has a 401k, then most 401ks today have a Roth component in them. And so it would hold true. And you would want to do a 401k over a regular IRA, which is for an individual, just because oftentimes the company will do matching. So,
Yeah, like I think my company it's a Roth 401k and then also a standard 401k, and they allow you to choose which one you contribute to. And I think they'll
correct.
match both.
Yeah. And that's how they pretty much all work. Now, not all, the 401k aspect to a 401k or the Roth component to a 401k is relatively new, within the last 10 years for sure, maybe more of the last 5 years. So, they're just kind of seeing them starting to become prominently put in. So there still are some 401ks out there that don't have Roths in them.
Yeah. So now I know another big part of your business is estate planning. What's the one thing that most people overlook when they're thinking about protecting their wealth and wishes for the next generation?
Yeah. The two things that kind of came to mind initially would be just making sure you have your legal documents up to date. So usually what we kind of talk to people about with just kind of basic, legal planning, we don't hold ourselves out to be attorneys or anything, but we'll say, you need to go talk to your attorney, about this. And that is, you're either going to typically have a will or some kind of living trust, just to, you know, deal with how are the assets going to get dispersed. And then some of the other documents that typically go along with that is, one would be considered a community property agreement where all the assets will just pass over to the other spouse at the time of death. Some states are already community property states, and some states treat everything as separate assets. And then secondly would be a durable power of attorney, which that just comes into play if somebody's incapacitated. You're sending somebody else to be able to make, decisions on your behalf. And then the last one is directed to physicians, making sure that they're, if they're in a hospital and maybe they're on life support systems, they can say how they wish to be treated. So we encourage people to make sure that they have one, or if they have had one, that they're updated. Uh, and then the second thing that I think is equally important is just dealing with, you know, beneficiaries and, the other thing is called a transfer on death. So a beneficiary is typically anything that's attached to like a retirement account or something like that. A transfer on death is just when you have a regular account that's not a retirement type of account, and you can say who you want the money to go to if you were to pass away. And what I found in my, 37 years here is that there are problems that come up if, people aren't addressing those. So sometimes it's, they're putting minor children on the accounts and, now they pass away. That money gets frozen until they're 18 and all of a sudden they get it at 18, or whoever was the custodian that's supposed to be taking care of them doesn't have the assets now to take care of them during their minor years because all that money's been tied up. So, we're going to encourage people to not put minors on there, put whoever the custodian is. The other thing you'll see oftentimes is, somebody gets divorced and, they don't ever change the beneficiary on the 401k. They end up getting remarried or whatever. Now they're not even working at that same job, so that account kind of gets lost over time, and now they pass away and, it's the ex-spouse who's going to get the money. So there's problems along those ways too.
Yeah, you always hear about those, the unclaimed money and stuff like that. And I think
Yeah.
those are typically like 401k accounts that people lost.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think lastly with estate planning is, each state, has state tax laws. Like here in Washington State, if your estate is over 3 million, you're going to be paying some state tax to the state of Washington. And so we're, constantly trying to help people with knowing about that and what are some of the ways they can manage that to where, they each, have an exemption that they can use to, help minimize that tax. But oftentimes they don't know it. And so what happens is that the first death, that exemption gets lost. And now all the assets roll over to the remaining spouse. Now all of a sudden the estate's too big and, they're going to pay some estate tax at the second death. So those are probably the three things that, we kind of deal with people on estate planning.
Yeah. So now this may be something we discussed previously, but what is one common piece of advice that you hear often that you disagree with?
Well, I think I've kind of changed my mind about this one, but through most of my career, this one kind of have held, and that would be going back to, these retirement plans that grow tax deferred. So you were talking about the traditional 401k or the traditional IRA. And, all along kind of the mantra was to put money into these accounts, you're going to save the tax today. And then, it could possibly put you into a lower tax bracket, when you do that. And then when you retire, you're not going to make as much money and you'll, take it out at a lesser tax bracket. So they were pushed pretty heavily for, most of my career. And there was merit to it. Back in the 80s, there were 15 income tax brackets. and today we have seven. So the brackets were much smaller. So it was very possible that if you were deferring money, you could lower yourself from one bracket to another bracket by doing that. And, then when you retired, you were typically in a lower bracket. So you were taking the money out, in a lower tax bracket. So it's kind of a win-win, you save money today, you put yourself in a lower bracket today, and then you take it out of the lower bracket. But what ended up happening is, all those tax brackets have changed over time. Now they're much bigger. So typically, whether you defer money or not, you're not saving any tax today other than what you were just saving on the contribution. And then the big concern is, what's going to happen when you retire? I think we all know that we're in trillions of dollars of debt. And, most of us feel that tax brackets are going to probably be higher in the future than they are today. Don't know when, but, probably are going to be. And so, you don't necessarily want all your money in tax deferred, you know, at retirement when, there's still this money that's going to be owed on the account. And so we see that quite frequently where somebody's biggest asset they have going into retirement is their 401k plan that's all tax deferred. And they really haven't, saved money outside of that. So now in retirement, they don't have a lot of choice. They're going to have to pull money out of that, possibly pay higher taxes because it throws them into a higher tax bracket. Now, what's changed that we've already discussed is now they have these Roth accounts, into the 401ks and the IRAs. So that's made it better now.
Yeah. So now looking back on your entire life as a world ranked athlete and a long haul financial advisor, what would you say is your greatest achievement that brings you the most satisfaction today?
I'm just kind of thinking about that. I think they both do, but I think they're kind of for different reasons. I kind of feel like I've left a legacy in both of them. I think with, the javelin throwing of, being a school record holder at the University of Washington and just some of those achievements I had. I mean, I think there's, a legacy that got left there. And, when I kind of think about that, most of that was you know, through personal achievement, which then kind of makes me reflect on self. Like I did good things with, what I was given and made the most of my opportunities. And then when I think about the legacy with financial planning, really it's 37 years of helping other people, be better off in life because of, the advice that we've given them. And just to think of all those people that, you've been able to help. And I think that's where the legacy is on that is, being able to help others. And so I'm probably equally proud of both. I mean, I feel like, there's been similarities in them, with planning and goals and, hard work and all those types of things. But that's kind of how I would separate them. That, one was for me, the other one was able to help others.
And I think we've definitely given a lot of good practical advice to people through this episode too. Thank you everyone for listening. This is the final episode in this chain. I hope you've enjoyed the fascinating connections and will take an opportunity to find out just how connected you yourself might be to incredible people.